Good morning, everybody. Today is November 7th, 2025. We're here for a work session on AO 2025-119 and ordinance amending Anchorage Municipal Code Title 2, Sections 2.40.35, Recognition of Community Councils, 2.40.040, Establishment of Community Councils, and 2.40.090, Community Council Maps, or here at the 10-year review and adjustment of Community Council District boundaries. We're on the schedule from 8:50 to 9:50, and the first thing I will do is apologize to everybody for this early meeting. It just was impossible for us to schedule later because the budget work session we have to finish today at midday. So thank you all who have made it and who will tune in over the rest of this time. Let's go ahead and start with introductions.
Cameron Gross again.
Jared Kirker. Scott Myers.
Anna Brody.
Christopher Constant.
Yaro Silvers.
On the phone we have
Aaron Baldwin.
Ms. Baldwin Day.
I'm here.
All right, so then we'll hand the ball off to Mr. Davis. Tom Davis, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Tom Davis, Senior Planner, Planning Department. And I'll just start out by giving a brief intro to myself and several other folks who participated in this process over here. Secondly, I wanted to just give a brief overview of the three phases of this public process and quickly go over the criteria and then quickly check and make sure that the packet is readable to you and some key items in the packet. First of all, we had a boundary advisory committee that the Federation and the Planning Department formed that went through this process. And I don't know if Melinda Gant, who's the chair, is able to make it yet, but ex officio member of that committee, Daryl Hess is here, and can also speak to the community council process. The list of the committee members is on page 43, Exhibit D1 in your packet. They were a key part of the first phase of the public process, which kicked off with a questionnaire survey that was received by about 10,000 people, received about 420 responses, plus additional emails and other comments. And those public comments that came from community councils, members of the public, established 40 boundary study areas as part of this project. So for this round, this decennial review of the community council boundaries, we based it on feedback from the public, from those new community councils regarding any boundary issues that they had. The Federation helped the Planning Department form the Boundary Advisory Committee, and it's a geographically representative committee of community council active members and leaders from Chugacto River, from around the Bowl, Trinity Arm. And with that committee, we walked through each of those almost 40 boundary study areas. The committee ran its meetings like a commission, open meetings, and so community council members of the public were invited to comment and provide advice and information. Through 6 meetings of that committee, we then, the next phase began. The second phase was to bring the community council boundaries to the Planning and Zoning Commission as a public hearing draft, recommendations of the Planning Department and Boundary Advisory Committee. We had informally engaged with the community council officers. So all community councils affected by any boundary proposal or public comment, we had been engaged with those officers, with those presidents. And it was at this phase that we requested each community council that was subject to any boundary study area to provide the community council's recommendations, its position as to its boundaries, in the form of a written resolution adopted by its membership. And in fact, 27 community councils provided resolutions as to their boundaries. And a few more community councils provided comments from their officers. The community council comments to the Planning and Zoning Commission and the resolutions, those are available in Exhibit D2, basically Exhibit D, the Part 2 of Exhibit D, and those are available on pages 25 through 110. In that Phase 2 process, several more community council boundary study areas came forward. So a boundary study area that we found just means that an area, it arose from public comments and that we are going to evaluate it. So we evaluated each boundary study area. So we evaluated about 40 boundary study areas in the first phase, and then during the public hearing process, an additional 5 boundary study emerged based on public comments from Basher, public comments from Glen Alps, public comments from North Star, and a few other folks. So all of those are available in Exhibit D, and then Exhibit E, we received a few more comments from community councils after the Planning and Zoning Commission process, and that's why that's separated out. The evaluation criteria are set in the Municipal Code, Section 2.40.040, and those are that the community councils shall reflect natural communities and to recognize community desires as boundaries. Now, with respect to natural communities, the code defines that as being community areas divided one from another by physical or traffic barriers. So we looked for strong, simple boundaries between neighborhoods that be easy for the public, for members of those community councils to easily understand their boundaries. You know, yes, I'm in this area. Secondly, areas having a common interest. And third, natural communities being areas that are achieving or have a common identity. With respect to community desires, community councils are not municipal government agencies. They are independent nonprofit organizations. And while the municipality recognizes them, they are from the grassroots. And so we do take comments from community council general membership seriously, and that criteria was important to us. We also use the questionnaires and other means. And we can go over those criteria. And then lastly, just going through the packet, I think it exhibits Exhibit A are the maps that are recommended, the new community council boundary maps. In most cases, those are the exact same boundaries as the old maps. We just had to overhaul the maps. They were 22 years old and they were old software and whatnot. So we had to overhaul the maps. It's a new set of maps. Secondly, Exhibit A, those maps, those are legal boundary descriptions, and so you can use those. There's some interpretation guidance in the code, try to interpret those, but those maps are designed so that you know exactly where that boundary is, you know, where it falls exactly. Exhibit B is the community council resolution. Skipping Exhibit C for a moment. Exhibit D is all the Planning and Zoning Commission packet materials, all the background materials, the questionnaire survey results, the boundary study area that we presented, and as well as all the minutes from the Boundary Advisory Committee. And anyone who wants to nerd out on the community council's process and learn a lot about how the community councils debated and decided on these issues, the 5 sets of minutes from those meetings is very informative, and it's a learning process for everyone. Exhibit C is for the assembly. And what we did in Exhibit C was to summarize the 12 boundary study areas where a recommendation has come to you to change community council boundaries. So Exhibit
Excuse me,
C,
Tom, what page is that?
Exhibit C is, well, it's just the third exhibit. It's after Exhibit B. Is there a page number?
There are page numbers in our packet.
Okay.
There should be.
And, oh gosh, it comes right after the community council resolution, right after the AM and the community council resolution. Or it started, sorry, the planning and zoning commission resolution. Sorry about that. So it's just Exhibit C, and it's about 19, 20, about 25 pages long itself. In any case, Exhibit C.
I really need us to find it. You're referring
Yeah,
to
okay.
something that you don't have to really enforce with
So
400 pages of
it
material.
comes after page 3 of the
606, I think.
resolution, community council resolution, which is Exhibit B.
I see Appendix B.
We're not talking about appendix, we're talking about exhibit.
Exhibits, yeah, assembly
Somebody needs us
exhibits.
to find where we're at and can't track it until we have some way to know
Okay, I got exhibit D.
where is that. Kind of how many
Exhibit D,
pages
there's no page number.
How many pages, like,
Oh, each exhibit set has their own set of numbers.
to the top, okay.
So,
Near the beginning.
There's also, if folks go back into the prior, this is a little harder to dig for, but the prior meeting, it does have the 8 different pieces of the packet broken up into separate PDFs. It just takes a few more steps to go back and down those. But that's not as much.
Sure, I'll send it on Mr. Jones.
It's 20 sheets in. So while you're looking for it, I'll just quickly overview it and finish. So basically, Exhibit C, it's in 2 parts. And the main part is summarizing the recommendations and the rationale and references to other resources in the package for each of those 12 boundary study areas where a recommendation has been made to change a community council boundary. So those are the 12 areas where there's a recommendation for change. It also, after those 12, it covers 5 community council boundary study areas where there's no recommendation for change, but those boundary study areas garner a fair amount of public discussion and in some cases disagreements. Those 5 include a study area in Northeast that was considered for transferring to scenic foothills. They include a Bellhaven Park, which was considered for transferring from South Addition to North Star. Similar case for the Ship Creek Boat Launch Facility, and 2 others. So Exhibit C, once you find it, is a great resource for you to hone in on those. I don't think to walk you through each and every one of those, but I can certainly quickly name them if you wish, but prefer to refer to save time for questions and answers. Thank you.
So, deeply substantive or?
What's the questions?
Okay, we'll start with you then. Go ahead, Ms. Burley.
Thanks. Yeah, I do have a couple specific, but we can dive into those after this. So two broad questions. One is, you talked about kind of the decisions about natural communities, and I guess the main observation I've seen through this process is geography is more sticky than the people. So we're not doing redistricting like we do with elections, so that there's equal representation, but it seems like a lot of the disputes end up being where, one council is bigger than the other, or, neighborhoods get built over time, and like you said, these maps are 20 years old, or maybe just the physical maps are. But just wondering how population or how balancing population has ever been considered, or because it's not a formal criteria, why it wasn't included.
Sure. So population was one of the criteria we looked at. And we looked at it in cases where that we got public comments or comments from community councils or other evidence that in fact community council boundary study area could affect the community council's sustainability to fill officer positions, meet quorum, and be representative. And so you might write this down in Exhibit D3, what the Staff and Boundary Advisory Committee did, in Exhibit D3 in pages 9 through 11 of our white paper report, is that we took those basic broad boundary criteria that we just talked about, and we elaborated on them into 7 boundary review criteria. One of the key boundary review criteria that we wanted to hit on was the idea of active representation. So that each member of the community, each property owner, each business, they have an active community council that represents them where they can participate in. And that's key. So that's fundamental. Then we go through the other criteria which I've named. We also had secondary factors. And in that, on page 11 in D3, and I think I referred to the page numbers of the actual report, we talk about population. And we're not trying to equalize population between community councils, but we do talk about it in 2 ways. One, if a community council appears to be so large that it's covering a lot of neighborhoods that are disparate, that don't relate to each other, some be left out, that is a concern. Secondly, obviously, if the community council population seems to be getting in the way that being able to function at all, that's also a concern. So for about a third or maybe even up to half of the community councils in that white paper, we did take the time to determine what the population was, and we reported that to the boundary committee, and we looked at those numbers. And they're in the report. They're not in Exhibit C. We do have forthcoming we think we'll submit it as an AIM. Just a nice list of population by community council. We're working on getting that from the census. We'll be able to get that. What we find is that community councils, neighborhoods, community councils are different sizes, and that's okay. If a community council has few members, it's very active, it's okay. So Sand Lake, Abbott Loop, they have very large populations. I don't know what the population is, we'll find out, but I bet it's closing on Northeast. And so we got a lot of comments about Northeast being too big, but geographically it's much smaller than Sand Lake. Loop similar size, but no one's talking about those community councils. So what may be happening in Northeast maybe have to do with natural communities or the other criteria about boundaries. It may be problems with the functioning of that community council. Population is a factor, but we did look at population, but we did primarily use natural communities. We weren't ignoring it for sure. unanswered.
Okay, I have some questions. I'll put you back on one there. I would note Aaron Balday just joined in the room, and I would note that Aaron Balday just joined us in the room. Did we just have someone join us on the phone up there?
Public.
Okay, thanks. Dean, you had your hand up.
Yes, if I may, thank you, Mr. Davis has done an excellent job here, and all the criteria he's described drives through our code, our section 240 establishment of community council districts. It has those, it says natural communities are finest areas, et cetera. The last sentence here, though, other populations consideration, the last sentence says population is not a criterion. So he's exactly right in how we look at population is so relevant, but it's not a criteria for the size of districts. And
How would you define population, Dean?
Well, I don't think the code has a definition for population here, but it's the Common Dictionary definition of population. What we get from
Would you consider it just the mere number, or would you consider it demographics, or what would you consider as population?
I think number only.
Okay, thank you.
I wouldn't hang my hat on that.
No, I
Mr. Davis and how he interpreted it.
Again, natural communities might get into that demographics piece relative to the question of population.
Just
Ms. Summers.
Hi, okay, so I am looking at the public comments from Northeast Community Council. 14 people said it was too large, 3 people said it was right-sized. I'm gonna read some of the comments, so bear with me. Should be broken into 2 councils. NECC should be split to create 2 smaller councils. Next one, it has become too disjointed and spread out. Next one, has effectively left out people who live in my area of town. Next one, it feels like there's a natural separation from the Glen Highway to DeBar and then DeBar to Northern Lights. Next one, residents have been arguing about splitting NECC for years and the board blocked an effort to create a new council. Next one, the boundaries need to be more closely aligned with the assembly districts. If you don't know, the assembly district cuts across on DeBar up to Turpin. And so south of DeBar is one assembly district and most of north of DeBar is another assembly district. Next one, you know, I probably actually don't need to read any more of these, but they continue on in that vein. There was a real effort to align with these comments as well as the comments by Scenic Foothills, which is to the south, saying that they were too small and they did not have the population numbers to really be sustainable with getting new board members and things like that, and they actually passed a resolution. At some point in the process, a couple people from Northeast Community Council decided that they didn't like the idea of splitting the council, and they kind of got some other members involved, and I think they ended up passing a resolution. That was kind of after all these public comments went through and after the real effort was put in to try to get better representation, community council representation for the people in that area between Northern Lights and DeBar. Anyhow, that was snuffed out, and now you shifted and decided to grab a whole chunk of population from University Community Council. And so this process is really, it's just really left me dumbfounded as to what the criteria was when the public comment clearly wanted that area. And I know you said that population is not a criterion, but what is a criterion is adequate representation. And when population is a piece of adequate representation, then you have to take that into consideration. And so I think this whole process, I'm not really supportive of the methodology. I'm not really supportive of the results. I think it's flawed.
Oh. Can I say something?
Sure, if you want to come up and discuss. I know Mr. Martinez just joined us on the phone about 9:15. About 9:15. Make sure you let us know what capacity you're speaking in.
So I attended all the meetings of the Boundary Advisory Committee. I was asked to be an ex officio member because I've worked with community councils a lot over the years, and my advice to the committee when this issue came up was it's putting the cart before the horse. If you read the code, a group of people have to hold public meetings, they have to draft bylaws, and then they petition the assembly to form a community council. So Northeast Community Council can't prevent anybody from doing that. So my advice was to potentially put a comment in the recommendations encouraging the assembly to seriously consider breaking up the community council if a group of people came to the assembly, followed the required process in the code, and petitioned to be recognized. So should the assembly be breaking up that council area, establishing a new council boundary before somebody petitions? That was the problem.
Right. So I'll let you go first, Ms. Lewis, and myself. I'm going to hop in too. Go ahead.
I mean, I guess the problem that I'm not actually talking here is about them creating another community council, but the fact that that community council was left as is, it was left with 30,000 members, and instead of taking the population, we had the other council that was too small, and instead of taking the population from the council that wanted and that pointed to the natural boundaries of DeBar, and instead of taking that population from there, you went to University Community Council instead.
Okay, so I'm going to pop in there and just a suggestion or a thought on this, that Daryl's right, we don't create community councils, but that seems a bit like a red herring. If the question is, what are the natural boundaries, the comments coming in, or it's disjointed, it's spread out, or you could even argue it's overrepresented by assembly members, legislators broadly. There are a number of ways you could get to the question of merit that you're raising without even using the word population, because we heard from council, population is not a criteria. Right, no, I get that, but the public comment talked about disjointed and spread out. Public comment talked about natural boundaries. What was the rationale there? Why didn't you kind of dive into that part instead of the question of population and a new council, which again seems like a red herring?
And for us, the planning department and the Boundary Advisory Committee recommended that if a group does come forward to form community council, that boundary be on the bar, and that it's split northeast into two along the bar, because the bar is boundary. You mentioned that it breaks up assembly districts. It also happens to be a boundary that breaks up elementary school attendance areas. It would be a good boundary. So the general recommendation is to retain existing boundaries, but at the time a group comes forward and wanting to form another community council, that the assembly support that. It was difficult for us to recommend breaking up the community council district now because we didn't have a group that was, we didn't have a community council to operate it. That was our.
That's very confusing.
One
question: did you have that in writing somewhere where you suggested that a community council, if it emerged at that boundary?
Yeah, that's in the white paper recommendations. It's on page 70 of Exhibit D.
Okay,
70 and 71. And the Northeast issues in detail on pages 69, 70, halfway through 71, and Exhibit D.
Well, that's why if it's in writing somewhere, that's going to be helpful for our process. Ms. Orton, I think to finish up there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what we're talking about here isn't creating a new community council. What we're talking about is recommendations for redrawing the borders.
Sure.
Okay? And instead of making a recommendation to redraw the border, the bar south, and put that area into scenic foothills, which I think would have solved the issues that were raised by both Northeast Community Council and Scenic Foothills Community Council. Instead of doing that, you recommended that it stayed at 30,000 people, and then you took membership from University Community Council, moving them from 10,000 people to 7,000 people.
Yeah, just a point of information regarding the boundary study area between University area and Scenic Foothills, just as an aside there. That boundary study area was the second most popular talked about questionnaire survey response.
So I'm gonna ask you that part until we come back around.
Okay,
Ms. Silvers can ask that question when she's back in the queue.
Okay, I'll just in a sentence say that boundary study area shifting between University and Scenic Foothills was its own issue. It was not instead of, and it would be recommended regardless of whether parts of Northeast were to be sliced.
So I would note that Mr. Monroe just joined us, and next in the queue, was it on this topic, Northeast, Ms. Baldwin?
Related.
Because I have a queue. If it was related to that, then I would say jump the queue, but if not, you should probably proceed early through the queue.
Go ahead.
Okay, Mr. President,
You can pass me.
Ms. Baldwin. Good morning.
Yeah. Good morning. Thank you for being here. So I think I'm unclear as to what the purpose of this process is, if not to do some of this puzzle piecing work. So University Area Community Council falls into my district, also Ms. Silver's district, so this is an area of shared concern for us. And Scenic Foothills is immediately adjacent. And I think my concern, and mirrors Ms. Silver's, is if this is not the appropriate opportunity to create equity and parity among community councils, that it becomes very difficult for the assembly to encourage individual groups of citizens to self-organize in a different fashion using a different process so that they are better represented in the community. And I think I'm struggling with that because this feels like the natural process by which something like that could happen. Scenic Foothills getting more people from a neighborhood that's immediately adjacent, University area perhaps retaining people who have been part of their community council for upwards of a decade or more. And so I think I would like to understand whether or not the Boundary Advisory Committee had other recommendations for parameters that ought to be considered or things that ought to be put in place in code in the future, so that the next time we go through this process in 10 years, we aren't stuck in the same sort of limbo situation where changes are very minimal and they don't contemplate things like community council participation or population within a boundary area. Because to me, in terms of like actual participation in the most local form of government we have, those are essential questions. And I don't think those should be left out just because they're not explicitly named or they weren't contemplated when these parameters were written. So did the committee have any suggestions to that end? Were there any internal discussions about how this process ought to be different in the future? And do you have any other reflections along those lines?
Sure. And first of all, about this process, I described it phase 1 and phase 2, and for better or worse for you, the assembly is phase 3. So the process is still going on, and there is still the opportunity for the assembly to discuss the concerns about Northeast, UNED, and Turia, and Scenic Foothills with the community councils and staff and determine if that we took those issues far enough. So it's still the process, and it's fine for the assembly to look into these. Secondly, the Boundary Advisory Committee did discuss several criteria and asked about several criteria, factors that several members thought should be considered. we've discussed population. But the other was legislative districts. Can community councils align with legislative districts, assembly districts, state legislature districts? Can they align with service districts, school district, tenancy boundaries? And in the that white paper, deep in your packet, when I described the criteria that we elaborated on pages 9 through 11 in the white paper, exhibit D3, and I can email that out and talk about that afterwards. That one of we did identify districts as a factor, and then secondly, the Boundary Advisory Committee on the Boundary Advisory Committee had a discussion in its last meeting regarding legislative districts, and they talked about should community councils follow legislative districts, and so they were a consideration. The committee discussed this on page 174 of Exhibit D. And they noted, with regard to assembly districts, there are 6 districts. There are legislative districts. We studied them, and we found that they do not match neighborhood boundaries in a lot of cases. They frequently run through the middle of what we think of as neighborhoods, right through the core of Spinard, right through the core of Airport Heights. Legislative boundaries, they have their own criteria, and they're not neighborhood oriented. And they also change more often than neighborhoods. So for the community council to be able to stay focused and allow their neighborhood members to participate in their neighborhood matters, community council districts are just different from electoral districts. But all things being equal or close, we did look into it. We looked into it, for example, in case of the university area community council, the assembly district boundary, it goes through university area and it slices down, I think Pine Street, right through the middle of a core neighborhood of university area. So it didn't seem appropriate just to break the neighborhood that way. And a similar case with Airport Heights and Spinard. So that's the one other factor that they discussed that you can find in their minutes. And their minutes did document all of their discussions. And they adopted their minutes.
I think that's a bit of a stretch to suggest from this dais in your professional position that their minutes captured all of their conversations.
I wrote them and they did.
I don't know, maybe all of the conversations that were in the moment of the formal conversation. I think those community councils have a lot of different conversations.
Oh, I'm sorry, it was captured the minutes of the Boundary Advisory Committee. Sorry about that.
I have a brief question on that. How was the Boundary Advisory Committee formed?
The Planning Department put out a request for representatives, geographically representative members. So we reached out to by basically sub-area of the municipality. So we looked for members from Turning and Arm, we looked for members from Chicago River, and then Northeast sub-area, Northwest sub-area. When I think of Northeast sub-area, it's more than Northeast Community Council, obviously Northeast part of the bowl. Northwest, the downtown area, Midtown, and then the Southwest, Sand Lake, Ocean View, also Ocean View area.
Clarifying question, is there a place within the document that identifies who?
Yes, the Boundary Advisory Committee, they're identified by Melinda Gant in her letter to the Planning and Zoning Commission, and that's in page 43 of Exhibit D1. And you have all 12 members there. It identifies who they are, what area they represent. Several members are at-large members, and of course, Daryl's an ex officio member.
And that was attachment D1 or appendix D1?
Exhibit, and I'm just trying to refer just to exhibits here. There's a lot of attachments and appendices related to the planning and zoning commission process.
I have, were you satisfied with Paul today?
For now.
And I would just offer that there's no universe in which we can create equity and fairness, but we certainly can work toward it. It's a philosophical theory as probably.
Thanks. I had another general question, and I know there's probably a lot of other questions, so maybe we can have just a brief answer. I just want a rationale for, this was raised by Turnagain Community Council, but I see it along multiple coastal councils. What is the rationale for, it looks like switching from the low tide line to the high tide line? The concern raised was that would not allow the council to basically be involved or make comments on something happening in those areas. I don't know if I imagine councils can take positions on anything, but just curious kind of why the coastline decision was made and what the significance of that is.
Sure, so the coastline boundary is currently mean low waters, mean low tide. The recommendation is to shift that to mean high tide, basically what we think of as the shoreline. And the community council is their concern. We looked into it, we investigated with the DNR. First of all, why are we proposing that in the first place? We don't know where mean low is. It's not a feature. It's in the waters of the inlet. It's areas of the inlet that for most of the day, or the majority of the day, are part underwater. And it's the mud flats. The maps that we have that show those boundaries are inaccurate. In some cases, they're really fanciful. In fact, and so we think somebody at NOAA may know, but the DNR doesn't know. The Public Works GIS Municipal Survey refused to give us a map of it because they can't say that it's accurate. We believe that it extends out miles into the inlet, so that each day the size of Sand Lake Community Council expands by about 3 times, and then it hurries back in at high tide. But we agree with the concern of that would this affect community council's ability to participate in decisions or projects out in the mud flats. So the DNR is the regulatory body that approves all leases, developments, and activities in the tidal areas up to about 3 miles, and it becomes federal. And the way they engage with the public about those kinds of things is through the state's online public notice system. And so members of the public must monitor that system, the municipality must monitor that system. The DNR does not mail out notices to community councils. So regardless of the community councils extending out into the mud flats, they're not going to receive notice, and their public comment participation opportunities are noted. It's kind of like Chugach State Park. It's wilderness. With regard to a lot of the areas of concern in the coastlands, like for example, alignment of the coastal trail, bluff erosion problems near the airport runways, the Fish Creek estuary. Those will remain within the community council boundary. And
Sorry, I know we have a lot of other.
question.
I know we have a lot of other questions. Just very brief answer, is anybody, by changing those boundaries, are any residents actually impacted? Is there anyone living between the low and high low tide?
No.
Okay, thank you.
There's a visual for you. Next in the queue, I have Ms. Soares.
You can go to the next. Might come back.
Yeah, so I don't have anyone else but myself, and briefly, just to go back to the question of how the commission was selected. You have a group that I've been able to identify now, and how did you choose those individuals?
Primarily, we were grateful that they came forward. In the case of Chiaki or River, we struggled to find somebody. But we looked for experienced folks who were active, who'd been leaders. And so that group of folks, they tended to be community council leaders or experienced folks. That wasn't universal. So we put the request out and we got responses. And we did not turn anyone away, but we kept the Boundary Advisory Committee to 12. And so 2 individuals did ask to be on the committee, and their request did not get to us until the committee had been formed. We told those individuals, and they were primarily interested in certain areas. So we told those 2 individuals I basically included them in the meeting invites, and the meeting discussions on each of those issues included them, and they participated, and others from their community councils participated. And those individuals were an officer or leader from Sonora Community Council and an officer or leader from Northeast Community Council.
So, looking at the list and hearing that, I wonder, it's just something I have to ponder, something maybe we can ponder together a little bit. Does it not then make sense that the recommendations coming out of the bodies of the leaders of certain community councils would be, don't change our community councils? Isn't there some reasonable kind of basis to believe people would self-select to protect the thing that they believe is kind of their domain?
In practice, that's not what I experienced. For example, the representative from University Area Community Council was strongly supportive of the public comments from the area between Baxter and Boniface to transfer to Scenic Foothills. And he was adamant that the criteria call for that. The Boundary Advisory Committee member from Scenic Foothills also called for change and actually provided a proposal that appears in Exhibit C to transfer areas of Northeast Community Council on the Scenic Foothills side of Chester Creek to Scenic Foothills Community Council. And most of the boundary study areas that were reviewed, in most cases, the committee members, they were really weighing in on advising on boundary issues outside of their own community council. And I think that I can't speak for the committee, but my observation was they took their role very seriously, and they wanted to be very transparent and follow the criteria. But
it's interesting then that most of the recommendations were, it appears, and I have to read it closely, hold the line. So,
I can say that they were very, my observation is that they were very deferential to community councils that were commenting. And so if a community council were providing comments, they were very deferential to that. So that might be a observation.
yeah, probably there are multiple factors that play into that. And one last piece of information, I think sometimes the conversation about boundaries gets overwrought in some ways, because procedurally, the department in the code recognizes a boundary, or not a boundary, what I jokingly called earlier, a DMZ between councils when policy decisions are being made and when the department is doing outreach to communities relative to a project on a parcel or what does that work? How does that work in planning? Wasn't it like a 500-foot margin for notice and other things?
Yes, it's a 1,000-foot margin. We consulted with the Parks and Recreation Department, and all processes regarding parks, for example, the Parks Department treats all community councils within 1,000 feet of that park equally. They're equal partners in steering the park.
Right. So for all of my kind of pushing our questions about boundaries and others, there is this permeability of our process. So just people should kind of think through that some of it. I have Ms. Summers and Ms. Baldwin. And we have about 10 minutes. I don't see there.
Yeah, I'm just I'm reading the whereas statements, and it says, whereas recognize community desires as to boundaries. And as you heard earlier, I read all the comments, or not all the comments, I read a sampling of the comments from Northeast Community Council saying that their council was too large, that the boundary would be better on DeVar, that the boundary would be better following the assembly districts, which is DeVar. There was one comment about house districts, which would have made a border of DeVar. And so the community desires obviously were not recognized in this recommendation unless they decide to go out and form a new community council. And so it feels like through this whole process, which I believe took 3 years, the inequity that people who commented recognized and asked to have something done about was baked in and was not addressed. Thank you.
Okay,
So we would be happy to work with the assembly and looking at, if you wish to investigate, scenarios where there is one scenario in Exhibit C where a portion of Northeast Community Council would be transferred. We can also provide information about the outcome population-wise of other scenarios. In fact, I think those are in Exhibit D, and again, we're still in this process, and we're happy to look at that. My only suggestion would be the code does call for the assembly to, and all of us to consult with the affected community councils about those, and not just me going back to them and getting their feedback. So.
I think maybe that's something we should put a pin in terms of process. I don't know that if the assembly proposes changes at the last step, that then mandates a trip back to review and consult.
I would say it does not. When we have all these proposals and options already laid out in the public process and the community councils have already commented, their resolutions meet that criteria. It's when we propose something new or different that they hadn't commented on. That's where when I interpret the code, I would see that the code is asking us to go back to the community council and get their feedback on it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an area of kind of something we would consider. I think we're going to let Daniel go first, see how much look was formed.
Sure. So, Chris brought up the 1,000 feet of any park, so I just want to comment on that and preview to folks that I am going to be bringing forward an amendment. And if you go one of two ways, there in my district, there's been competing resolutions between South Addition Community Council and North Star Community Council over who should have Valley of the Moon Park. And in the packet, I think with some information, the planning department's rationale over why South Addition should retain it. I think they mentioned like the riparian boundary, but in my mind, from an equity point of view, South Addition is very park rich. They have the park strip, they have Earl and Errol Keene Park, they have Godiah Park, They have portions of the Chester Creek Trail, they have Westchester Lagoon, Mill Bay Park, Elderberry Park, the Captain Hood Monument, Comfy Park, my own neighborhood, shout out K Street, I Street Community Garden, and Frontierland Park. North Star really just has a portion of the Chester Creek Trail and a C Street Gardens. And then they have a half of Charles Smith Memorial Park. So the boundary does kind of go through the lower third of that park between Fairview and North Star Park, or Fairview and North Star Community Councils. Valley of the Moon Park is really part of the identity of the North Star neighborhood. They walk across a little footbridge and then you're in the park. And at one point, I think even the rocket ship playground tower was used as part of their logo or part of the flyers that they would put out. And so the amendment could do one of two things. One would be to add Valley Moon Park to North Star, and its opposition could retain all of their other parks. Or similar to the Charles Smith Memorial Park, there could be a line that goes through the middle of the park, and so it would just be very clear that South Addition and North Star Park, this is part of their neighborhood identity. And it's been an interesting conversation. We even had a former manager of the FCC and the former president of the North Star Park, after North Star Park was kind of taking up this discussion, go to South Addition, I think tell South Addition that they should keep it. And anyway, all I have to say is it's been an interesting conversation. But for me, again, I think approaching it with a lens of fairness, I think it would be appropriate for North Star to really feel like they have some ownership over that park. Thanks.
And, Tom, go ahead.
No. And the summary of that issue is on page 32 and 33 of Exhibit C, and it's one of those 5 boundary study areas that got public conversation, no changes recommended, and I think the map for that, where you can see Valley of the Moon Park and that boundary is in Exhibit C, and that's on sorry, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think my initial response to this is that there's maybe a case study that more process and longer process isn't exactly always better process. I have 3 questions about the way that this was done. First, how exactly were commission members solicited?
The Boundary Advisory Committee?
Yes.
Yes, we went through the Federation and sent out requests to all of the community councils. The Federation did, the Planning Department did, we did by email, and then we received responses.
The Planning Department sent emails or received emails?
Send and receive.
Send them to whom?
All community council officers, I believe. I can double check that, but we, as I recall, we went through both the Federation and our own email system just to make sure that we were getting coverage. In cases where we were getting anybody for a particular sub-area, we did reach out to leaders that, I knew. For example, I reached out to Debbie Oceander and we found the fellow who ended up representing Eagle River area through her, which I was grateful for.
So the only real solicitation of committee members was through the existing community council system?
Yes.
Okay. Was there a rubric developed when you were contemplating these boundary study areas? Was there a rubric that sort of laid out priorities apart from just what a natural boundary was like, or what natural boundaries would make sense? Did you have like a scoring grid or something that was some form of objective and allow committee members to make those assessments independently before coming together?
We looked into quantitative scoring method, actually, the chair of the committee suggested we explore that. We couldn't determine like how to score like river versus a road versus, or strong boundary versus, what we found it was case by case. What we did do was we prioritized, in general order, prioritized the boundary criteria, so we broke them out into 7 criteria, and those are on, again, pages in Exhibit D3. I'm beginning to regret that I didn't include these in the front summaries of your packet, but in Exhibit D3 in the white paper, on pages 9 through 11 in the white paper. So if you go through those 7, they're in order of priority.
Okay.
In general priority, but it's so, different areas are so different from one another. You could have, like for example, in Daniel Boland's example, the strong boundary, and you'll see this in Exhibit C, would be to keep it at Chester Creek. The park is north of Chester Creek, it's in South Edition. But there are other factors involved. And so in that case, a standard rubric that we would apply to all cases consistently might still result in a less than optimal, recommendation. So we have to look at each area for what it is. In other cases, we looked at, the Seward Highway. Well, that's a strong boundary, and it's almost insurmountable, right? A community really has to be connected across that highway for us to want to jump that highway. So in some cases, boundaries, having a stronger boundary versus less boundary versus a stronger natural community or less, it just varies so much. So that's
Sure, yeah, I think I was just more interested in understanding whether or not, or how future processes might include something more like a sliding scale or something that actually allows for that nuanced conversation to happen in a way that isn't just sort of like vibes-based, which I think is at least my concern, given what I'm reading in these notes. In this document.
So we're just about to have one more question. I have a suggestion for you, Ms. Mullen.
Yes.
So the title of this ordinance is quite broad. And it could be a project to work with the attorneys to establish a section of the code now that states Assembly will be briefed on the priority scale, whatever that we were just describing in advance of the process beginning, phase 1. And so I think you could add by amendment into this document at this time a structure to achieve that by the next go round. Because that title is really broad.
I appreciate that suggestion.
Dean has got a little consternation because it says in order to carry out the 10-year review, but I would offer that it still is in order to carry out the 10-year review. And so I would just offer you have some flexibility within which to achieve that for the next body because you're seeing it now in relief. Ms. Saunders, last comment, we are out of time.
I'm looking in here for some comprehensive minutes on the board meetings. I see some planning and zoning minutes that are pretty spare. Anyhow, do you have recordings of those meetings, or do you have some minutes that kind of follow the whole conversation that was had around the recommendations?
Yes, the recordings of the minutes are on the project webpage.
Okay.
I think you can get to that from the AM. The minutes are there in your packet. They're on pages 157 through 212 of D1.
Are they action minutes or are they detailed?
I think they're minutes that summarize. I think other people say that it's too detailed.
Right, okay.
They're detailed.
Fair enough. Not action minutes.
They're detailed.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So, obviously, it's a hot topic, the project is coming before us. The administration has expressed their interest in seeing this pass sooner than later. However, the Assembly, having just received it after 3 years of process, does not mean that we need to rush through this process, because you are not just a rubber stamp. And so that question is one for the body to take up when this item is properly before us after the public hearing. So just folks, keep that in mind, that you are not constrained. If they have 36 months to work on it, you don't have 2 weeks. So
Just a point of information, it was not a 3-year process, it was about a 1.5 year process with long breaks in between the
Right.
staffing issues.
right,
The community councils were very timely and did not contribute to the length of the process. It was simply staff had to take long breaks.
yeah, no, I wasn't pointing to community councils. I just would suggest that it is 3 years post reapportionment, realignment, all of that stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, we're not 10 years out from the next time. We're 7 years out from the next time. So that's just math. But it's not a judgment. But definitely, we're going to take just a 10-minute break. We'll be a little bit late started, but